them. So I won't even say anymore. I'll just let Matt take it away. But Matt, thank you. It's all yours.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Nice winter day to connect with some warm words and some wonderful poets. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll take it away. So give me just a second to do that. So welcome to the Nature of Poetry, part of the Harris Center's wonderful Environmental Studies Institute. And we'll meet 3 times and we'll kind of do a quick sketch of the course as we get into these introductions, but away we go. So let's take off. This is going to be our opening image. This, as you know, is part of the Super Sanctuary that the Harris Center is proud to participate in. That's Spoonwood there in the foreground and North Pack in the background. But we'll also add this as part of our kind of tableau for the course. This is the cover page of one of the first collections of poetry published in New England. You can see the date at the bottom there, 1673. This is Anne Broadstreet's poems. And she's a wonderful, amazing poet, but we'll look at many amazing poets over the weeks ahead. So this will be our kind of tableau to begin and end each session. Nature and poetry and the connections between the two. So the goals of the course, these won't be surprising, but it'll get us all on the same page. We want to explore a diverse range of classic nature poems and classic nature poets or poets who connect with the living world. We want to, at the same time, deepen our understanding of what poetry is in the first place. That's often a question that's not asked, or at least not explored particularly well. We sort of assume we know what poetry is and how it works and what it's for. So we'll try to deepen our understanding of that along the way. We'll develop a community of inquiry in the seminar. That's super important. Any great seminar becomes a little community unto itself, and we'll do that even through Zoom. You can really create wonderful sense of community, and we'll position ourselves for further learning after these 3 weeks are over. And then maybe the most important goal is to enrich our everyday experience of the living world. So those are our goals. Today's session, we're going to introduce ourselves, not verbally, but in the chat, or if you're not comfortable with the chat, you can just send me an email to 2 sentences. Who are you? Where are you? Some people have already begun to populate the chat with those introductions. How do you spend your time? What are the questions that bring you to the course? So what's driving you? What's interesting you about this material? Why did you sign up and send Miles your money? Put those introductions into the chat or into an email to me. I'm going to collate them. Just do it right now. I'm going to collate them and send them back out to you so you can have a sense of who we are and where we are and what our questions are. There's a sense of the community's intelligence and the community's questions that we're going to gather up, and that'll help us shape the conversation and shape the presentations in the weeks ahead. So go ahead and put that in the chat right now. Take a look at what some other people have put there. You can use those as models or inspiration. I'll give you like 60 seconds just to finish up your two sentences. Doesn't have to be long. Who are you? Where are you? What brings you here? How do you spend your time? Those are the questions. I'll answer those while you're typing. So I'm Matthew Meyer Bolton. I go by Matt usually. I live in Keene with my wife, 2 kids, and dog Stanley. We are filmmakers. We own a production company that does short films and animation. That's how we make a living. I used to be in the academy. I used to teach at Harvard Divinity School. And so I've done a lot of teaching in the humanities generally, philosophy, religion, and kind of social questions. Certainly the natural world has really interested me throughout my career. So that's what brings me here. My driving question is how poetry can help humanize all of us and me personally, how it can enrich my own kind of life and human experience, how poetry does that. I happen to think poetry is one of the most important things in the world, but we'll talk about that as we get into the course. Not the only thing that's important, but one of the most important in my opinion. All right, so the next step today, we'll do a syllabus overview. We'll also, I'll present a little bit about what poetry is for. Then we'll engage some of today's poems. not all of them, but a good portion of them. Each week we'll read more than we'll talk about, but we'll weave in references to other poems that we don't talk about explicitly each week. So we've already introduced ourselves. Hopefully you're finishing up your introductions. Now we'll do a brief syllabus overview. Some of you have already looked at the syllabus, but just briefly so we're all going in the same direction. Today we'll do intros as we've just done, some fundamentals, and look at some early nature poems, or relatively early. We'll talk about what early means in just a second. Next week, we'll look at stories and symbiosis. So that'll be kind of two themes, looking at poems that help to make worlds that we can then inhabit. And then the final week, we'll look at the theme of dwelling. So poems that help us to dwell and help us to create homes that at the end of the day, any engagement really with nature and poetry, I think, is about living in the world and creating a sense of home, not only for ourselves, but for other creatures, and human creatures and non-human creatures. So I think that's ultimately what's at stake here, is home ground. So that'll be our theme in 2 weeks. So along the way, we're going to kind of piggyback on the work of Robert Macfarlane. He's an amazing writer. He's got lots of amazing books. Some of you may know some of his other stuff. His book Landmarks is what we're going to focus on in this course. And, you know, we're not going to dive too deep, but we're going to take some of his wisdom, sort of skim some of his great insights off the top of his work. Landmarks is a book about landscape and language, and how landscape and language connect with each other. It's actually filled with little glossaries of the land. So when human communities live in a landscape for a long time, they develop language for how to describe that landscape. And Macfarlane's argument is, if we lose those words, if we lose the landscape, we will lose the sense of the land, and we'll lose the sense of ourselves. So he thinks that these terms, these words, are really, really important. One of his projects is actually on children's literature. He's very concerned about how in the most recent children's dictionaries, some really basic terms about the natural world have been removed. The argument being that a lot of kids don't interact with robins or, you know, different kinds of trees. So they've actually taken those words out of the dictionary, and Macfarlane uses that as a symbol for what's going wrong with our relationship with the land. So Macfarlane's an amazing guy, but we'll use this book as a guide each week. We'll kind of pick up a couple of his key insights, and he's got wonderful ideas. So the last thing to say about the syllabus is that each week we'll have suggested poems. As you know, hopefully you've engaged the syllabus already and read some poems. So each week there's a suggested set. We won't talk about all of them, but we'll talk about many of them and probably most of them. And then there's another set for people who want to go deeper. So other poems or other texts, prose, if you want to explore some of these themes even deeper, including Robert Macfarlane's work. And then each week also has some jaunts or field trips, suggested places to go or things to do, and then writing prompts. Because so I know some of you are writers, and there's something called a commonplace book. You may know about commonplace books. They go back all the way to antiquity, but they were really hot in the Renaissance in the West, and then they enjoyed a revival in the 19th century. They're basically a compendium. It's a journal, but instead of diary entries, you write down poems or sections, excerpts from prose that you come across, or it might be a phrase or a line or a section of a poem. It might be a whole poem, something you read in a novel or an essay, and you put that down in your commonplace book. And then you might put some of your own observations too. But what it becomes is a technology for gathering together insight and then reviewing that insight easily. And how many of us have come across a great idea or a great phrase, and then a couple of weeks or days or months later, we've forgotten it, or it just kind of slips between our fingers, and then maybe we stumble up against it in a couple of years and we say, oh, I remember that. It's been so long since I've read that poem. So a commonplace book is a way to keep track of that, and then you review it and keep it fresh in mind, and you can live through those great ideas. So that's a commonplace book. So nothing's required. It's just a friendly suggestion that you start a commonplace book for this class or for your life. All right, that's the overview. And now we'll dive into the presentation and what is poetry for. So what is poetry anyway? You ask 100 people on the street, a lot of people will say this. They'll say, oh, it's metrical language and it's a language that rhymes. Or they might say it's deep thoughts. Those poets, they really have, really deep ideas. Or they might say there's short texts. There's lots of white space on the page. They use figures of speech like similes and metaphors. That's what poetry is. So I don't need to convince you because you've signed up for a course like this, but these definitions are really insufficient, that poetry is much more than these things, and it's much more interesting than these things. Although I think most people think that poetry is something like this. And that's, each of these, sure, there are deep thoughts in poems, and sometimes there's rhyme, and sometimes there's a metaphor. But poetry is so much more than that. So what is it? What is poetry? Let's go to Emily Dickinson first. Here's what she says poetry is. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only way I know it. So the first thing to say about this definition is that it's almost a refusal to define poetry. It's a refusal to say, oh yeah, it has these formal characteristics. It focuses on the effects of poetry. It makes her so cold, no fire can warm her. Makes the top of her head fly off, right? It's focusing on the effects, and that poetry has this physicality to it, a physical effect on her, makes her cold or makes her feel as if her head is removed. All right, so much for Emily Dickinson. How about Mary Oliver? What does Mary Oliver say poetry is? She says, poetry is a life-cherishing force. For poems are not words, after all, but fires for the cold, ropes let down to the lost, something as necessary as bread in the pockets of the hungry. So Oliver focuses on poetry as a help, as something that helps us, that nourishes us, that rescues us, that warms us in the cold. It's interesting to put Dickinson and Oliver side by side here. Dickinson saying, poetry makes her so cold no fire can warm her. Oliver says a poem is a fire for the cold to warm us up. Two different emphases, but they both are focusing on the effects of poetry. And in the case of Oliver, these are almost life-saving effects, or effects that enrich our lives to the point that we describe it in terms of warmth, rescue, and even bread. Stéphane Mallarmé is a French poet and critic. He is a wonderful figure who's worth studying. He has a famous definition of poetry that goes like this. It is the job of poetry to clean up our world-clogged reality by creating silences around things. So you almost don't want to say anything else after you read that definition. Poetry, even on the page, there's so much white space on a page. There's a kind of silence around each word. It slows us down. It focuses our attention. It clears things away. So this isn't about poetry as what it's doing or introducing. It's about how it's clearing things away and creating silence. It's a totally different lens for thinking about what a poem is supposed to do. Donald Hall, who is a wonderful New Hampshire poet who was married to Jane Kenyon, we'll be reading some of Kenyon's poems later in the course. His nice little concise definition of poetry is a school for feeling. And here he means by feeling not only emotion, the emotion of joy or the emotion of sorrow, but also feeling like how it feels to be betrayed, or how it feels to be in love. It's not only emotions, it's experiences. So poetry, says Hall, is a school for kind of sensitizing us to those different aspects of life. Oftentimes with a poem, you say, oh yes, that's how it is. That's exactly how it feels. And that's the kind of thing that Hall is thinking about. And then this one's one of my favorites, Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Poetry, the best words in the best order. So that's all he could do. And again, it's a kind of refusal to define it. All of these definitions refuse to say, oh yeah, these are the formal characteristics of poems. It's all about what poems do. And in that sense, it's all about what poems are for This is Norman Rockwell's picture of a boy reading an adventure story. And I think a lot of people think of reading in this way. And it is in this kind of thing a lot of the time. It's a kind of portal to another world, right? A kind of escape from reality. It's an alternative world. But poetry sometimes has that function, but it often has almost the opposite function. You can think of it more like this, like a magnifying glass or a telescope, something that clarifies and allows us to enter the world, to see the world more clearly, to notice things that we would not otherwise notice. And so this is a wonderful definition of not just poetry, but art by Jane Hirschfield, who is a great poet and a great essayist. Good art is a truing of vision in the way a saw is trued in the saw shop to cut more cleanly. So good art or good poetry, it sharpens or hones our vision. It allows us to see things we might miss. It trues us up. And in a sense, I would say it trues up at its best, of course, but it doesn't always do this, but at its best, it trues up our humanity and allows us to sense the world, not only see the world, but sense the world more clearly and more vividly. It brings us alive in that sense. All right. So this brings us to Robert Macfarlane and what he thinks, not just poetry, but language generally does for our relationship with so-called nature or the living world. Again, this book is about language and landscape and the connections between the two. He points out or makes the case that words help us name, and naming can help us notice. So for example, if we go to Scotland, even in our mind's eye, if we go to Scotland and we look out on the moors, right? A lot of people might say, oh, look at this barren moor. It's just a barren landscape. But cultures who have lived on the moors for hundreds of years, they've developed this very finely tuned vocabulary for describing the moors and describing the little variations and the peat and the heather and so on. And if you know that language, then you'll be able to see much more. If you don't know that language, then it just looks like a wasteland. And so in this book, Macfarlane collects these glossaries, including some Scottish ones. He's British, so there's a lot of Britain in this book. But the basic idea crosses cultures all over the world. He says language deficit leads to attention deficit. If we don't have the language, if we don't have the poetry, I would say, then we can't have the attention, or we have some attention, of course, but it won't be as finely tuned. It won't be as sharp. It won't be as true in Hirschfield's sense. So here's an example, okay? 2 words from Macfarlane that he discovered in his research. One is purr and one is smuse, all right? Purr is a word from the Shetland Islands, so it's a Shetlandic word, and it means a light wind that creates a certain pattern on the surface of water. And that pattern is like little cat paws. So that's what the word purr means in the Shetlandic language. It means a light wind that creates a little pattern on the surface of water. This isn't, exactly purr, but it evokes it. It gives you the idea that water can create these little depressions when there's a light wind blowing over its surface. Ever since I've learned this word, I have noticed this a lot more often. I'm sure I've seen it before, but now I see it all the time. I see the little cat paws on the surface of water. The other thing I notice is the wind, because when I see the cat paws, then I feel the light wind on my cheek. So just knowing the word opens our eyes. That's Macfarlane's argument. Now, what about smuse? This is a smuse. The smuse is a word from the Sussex area in England, so it's a dialect word, and it means a little passageway, a little tunnel that an animal creates in a hedge by using that entrance or exit over and over again. Here's another one, in case you want to see another smuse. So look at that image on the right. I've seen that before, you've seen that before, something like that. And you might notice a little dark spot, but you don't know the word smuse. Or maybe you do, but I didn't know the word smuse. But now that I know the word smooth, now I can see it better. I can say, oh yeah, I see what that is. That's a little animal passageway. That's a path. That's a little highway. That's a little, corridor. And you can see how the grass is matted down, and you can see that there's an animal going through there. Maybe it's a hedgehog, maybe it's a beaver, maybe it's, muskrat, maybe it's something else. But SMUs, if we have these words at our disposal, per, we will see and feel the woods and the ponds differently. SMUs will look at hedges or natural bushes and hedges in a different way. So per and SMUs, that's the kind of thing that this book is full of. Of course, there's thousands of examples of this kind of thing. So what does this boil down to? In a way, it boils down to love, because we love what we particularly know. If we only generally know something, we can't love it, not really. We have to know it in its particularity. If we know it particularly, it doesn't guarantee that we'll love it, but everything we love, we know particularly. So that particular language, that ability to pick out the certain kind of heather, or the certain kind of peat, or the SMUs, or the per, that can open the door to love. So language generally, this is McFarland's argument, language generally, and poetry in particular, produces experience. It doesn't just describe experience, it produces experience. It makes me experience the wind and the water differently. And so it produces knowledge. And if it produces knowledge, particular knowledge, it opens up new possibilities for affection. And as E.M. Forster, the famous novelist, said, it all turns on affection. All right, so what's poetry for? There she is up in a tree. To hone our attention to creatures, things, and feelings, both emotions and what living feels like, to enrich and expand our imagination and sympathy, to produce knowledge, and to open the door, at least potentially, to affection. Ding, there we go, affection. All right, so that's the beginning. We'll return to McFarland in future weeks, because he has got lots of other great ideas too, but that's just the beginning, or a taste of how he can help open some doors for us as we get into these poems. But let's get into the poems now. We've got some great ones and some classics. So let's see. We're gonna notice first as we discuss these poems. This will be our methodology for how we'll discuss them. So we're not gonna, you can raise hands if you want, but you can also just dive in. I find that usually happens, usually works pretty well. Just dive in when we get to the discussion. Notice first, wonder second. So wonder means, I wonder this, or I have this question, or I wonder if what she means is, or I wonder if what he's getting at is. So not closing down on an interpretation, but just kind of opening up with a wonder kind of a statement. And then the third move will be to interpret, to say, here's what I think this poem means. Here's what I think he's getting at. So this will be the choreography of how we'll discuss the poems. I just find it over the years to be really helpful to first notice things instead of rushing to interpretation. So our first poem is not going to be 3,000 years ago, but nature poetry starts at least 3,000 years ago. In fact, it starts way before that. Nature poetry, or what we might call nature poetry, has been around really as long as human speech has been around. Songs and oral tradition, right? Most of human history has been oral, not written, but oral. And surely nature poetry had oral forms and still does today in many cultures that are primarily oral. But we can point to written poems at least 3,000 years old that we could count as nature poetry. So for example, from the Psalter, right? The meadows clothe themselves with flocks. The valleys deck themselves with grain. They shout and sing together for joy. So this is essentially a nature poem from the Bible, from Psalm 65. By the way, many of us will sing Joy to the World in a couple of weeks. And Joy to the World is a poem, right? It's written by Isaac Watts, and it's based on Psalm 98. So that while fields and floods, rocks, hills, and plains repeat the sounding joy, right? So that is the same idea here that we see in Psalm 65, the idea of nature singing for joy. You see that in Psalm 98, you see that in Psalm 19, you see that all over the place. So nature poetry is at least 3,000 years old, and really much, much older than that. But we will start just a couple of hundred years ago with what's often called the English Romantic movement. And these two gentlemen who really have a lot of influence on a lot of things that follow in English speaking poetry. So on the left is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. On the right is William Wordsworth. And they were friends, and then they weren't friends. They had a falling out. But when they were friends, they were intense friends. They went for walks all over the Lake District in England. So this is Rydal Mount is the name of this house. It is the house where Wordsworth lived in the Lake District. You can see the hills there behind the house, beautiful setting. And Coleridge and Wordsworth would walk around the Lake District. They'd have philosophical conversations. They'd compose poetry. This is an image of the Lake District. Imagine those two poets in the 19th century walking side by side. It's said that Wordsworth composed many of his poems to the metronome of his feet as he walked, the kind of the pacing as he walked along, that he would compose poems on his long walks through the Lake District. By the way, Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, went to visit them when he was a young man, was very influenced by them. And he and some other writers thought that they could form a new Lake District here, basically in this part of New England, on the model of the poets of this Lake District in Old England on the other side of the pond. So we'll look at one of Wordsworth's poems. This is his famous, probably his most famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. And so what we need now is an intrepid mountaineer who is willing to read this poem. Just unmute yourself and say, I'll do it, and then read the poem. It's got 4 stanzas, so I'll click through it, or you might have it in front of you. I'll click through it so you can read it, and then we'll listen, and then we'll discuss. So who is our fearless volunteer to read this first poem? You know you want to.
I'll do it, Matt.
Fantastic.
I wandered lonely as a cloud. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 I saw at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth they show me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And when my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils.
It's beautifully read. Very nice expression coming through the voice, which is essential with this poem because he's talking about that kind of delight. So let's open up our discussion. So what do we notice first? And then we'll move to wondering, and then we'll move to interpretation. So what do we notice? Who wants to start?
Joy. I noticed joy.
Great. Where did you notice it in particular?
Just the descriptions of how happy he feels from these flowers, and the fact that they dance.
Yep.
That they bring wealth.
Wonderful. Great start. Who's next? What do you notice?
I saw the contrast. He's lonely, and it's the number of daffodils that is so joyful for him, that just the vastness of it.
Yeah, that's good.
And the second stanza, I just noticed he's focusing in on the daffodils, but all of a sudden the poem like expands to the whole universe. He goes out to it makes him think of the Milky Way.
Right. You can't get more expansive than that. Yeah, that's a great observation.
And the daffodils have given him joy for life. In the last stanza, he says that they flash upon the inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So he can forever conjure this moment and bring joy to himself.
Yeah, that's great. It's almost as if he's saying that he gets more pleasure in the memory, because when he's seeing there, he's saying, I gaze and gaze. He does say he feels gay, he feels happy, but it's almost like it's just as pleasurable later, or even more pleasurable later. That's an interesting part of the poem. The retrospect is just as delightful.
Well, I think those of us who have had children could kind of say that too. All the work of tending and raising, and then in reflection, they were the most wonderful days.
That's good. Yes.
Well,
Yes.
and also in memory, you can enjoy it, or it can happen again for you many, many times. The original was just once, but the memory is many times.
Yeah,
So
that's great. That's true.
I noticed that he used the word dance in one form or another in every single stanza.
That's great.
interesting. So let's see. Let's test this. Okay, there's dancing there in the last line. There's dancing again in the last line. There's dancing in the first line, and there's dancing in the last line. There it is. A dancing poem. Any questions or wondering about this, or kind of let's move toward interpretation now, but we can move through some wonderings or open-ended speculation. Any ideas?
Well, just to extend the last couple of comments, that there's two kinds of seeing. There's the outward seeing, and I gazed and gazed, which is really compelling. But there's another kind of seeing that would go under imagination or memory, and that's just as strong and brings just as much pleasure.
Other ideas? What is he getting at here? What's his point? What's his meaning? What is he after?
Yes, I wonder about the opening line and the title. We talked about the bliss that he feels and coming across this scene in memory, but why was he wandering, and why is the cloud lonely?
Yeah. That's a great question. Any ideas there? What about that opening line?
I was just going to connect it to the on my couch I lie in vacant or in pensive mood. So being lonely, vacant, pensive seemed to make one more open to this kind of experience.
are needing it.
Right. The consolations of the natural world. Yeah.
I felt like he was suggesting that we need to be more present when we're in the natural world and really take in
Mhm.
everything that we can, so that we can treasure it and savor it and use it, use it when we need it.
Yeah.
It's so many of the poems that you presented to us, being on high, as he says in the second line, gives you extended vision. But here, perhaps there's something lonely about that, and he wants us to get us down right with the flowers.
Mhm.
There's just something about that.
Yeah.
I wonder if Wordsworth used nature as his nurturer to help him when he was feeling lonely or pensive or depressed even.
Yeah. Yeah, you get the feeling that nature has restorative powers for Wordsworth, both in presence and in memory. Yeah. Just
It does-
go ahead.
It does change from that first line where he has lonely. Then at the third third line from the end, the bliss of solitude, it's totally turned around. Doesn't sound like he's lonely anymore because he has the daffodils with him. You know, it's a kinship with nature that stays with you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Right, the daffodils are personified like companions. Yeah.
Yeah, he calls them a company, a jocund company.
Yes.
And a host.
Right. Yes. Angelic. Yeah. Taking a step back, it's just good to remember that the whole Romantic movement, so-called, not only in England, but across Europe and really across the West, it certainly has its forms here in New England and in the United States. It was a response over and against the perceived ills and evils of industrialization. So
Right.
this idea was that we've left the farms behind, we've gone into the cities, we're in the mills and the factories and the smut and the smog and the degradation of human society. We need to return and restore back into the countryside. We've lost it. We've lost nature, and so that's often the driving argument in many of these kinds of poems.
And it's not perhaps just a nostalgia to go back, but in a sense, I always think of Romanticism as we go back in order to go forward. We bring both with us.
Yes, yes. Right. It's not trying to do away, but it is trying to return and reincorporate the natural world into our lives. Great. Well, that's a great beginning. The next poem that we'll look at is, we're not going to read it and discuss it deeply, but I did want to highlight a few things. This is Coleridge, because I want to get to both Johnson and Dickinson, but I did want to highlight a couple of things. So this is a lovely poem in its entirety, Frost at Midnight, especially in the winter. It's a great poem to read in the winter. But the last two stanzas, I think, are really kind of classic and representative of this kind of tradition of poetry. So first thing is that he's talking to his son. So he's talking to an infant, and he's actually reciting or delivering, you could say, the poem to his son as the son sleeps by his side, cradled by his side. You can see there in the first line. These are the last two stanzas of the poem. And he's rejoicing that the son, he says, will learn far other lore than he did in other scenes. For I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw not lovely but the sky and stars. So surrounded by ugliness, and only the sky and stars were his only source of loveliness. But you, my son, but thou, my babe, you're going to grow up in a much better environment. You're going to walk the lakes and shores. You're going to be ensconced in your life in the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language with thy God utters. So he's seeing the natural world as a divine or eternal language that you can walk in. So that it's an interesting idea that to see nature as itself a language, almost a kind of evocation of the psalm, or the idea that is represented in the psalm, which is very long-standing and crosses many religions, the idea of the world as a form of divine speech. And so therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee. So you see this idea in Emerson, you see it in Thoreau, you see it in Dickinson, you see it all over the place in the Transcendentalists, men and women who were devoted to engaging the natural world as a form of restoration. All seasons, not just the summer, but also the winter. And with these famous last lines of this poem, the secret ministry of frost, even the silent icicle. So we can hear this language even in silence when we look at an icicle at night, quietly shining to the quiet moon. So this last 4 or 5 lines are very famous. So I just want to highlight those, but what I really want to get to is Emily Dickinson. So who would like to read the Emily Dickinson poem? Emily, of course, in Amherst, many people think of her as a recluse. She was not a recluse. She was very social, but she was private, and she did write a lot of poetry up in her room in that house in Amherst. So who would like to read the Dickinson poem? Maybe someone we haven't heard from. Go ahead, go ahead. Yeah, perfect.
I'd love to read this one. I think I could spend about 2 days talking about this poem.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Before I got my eye put out. Before I got my eye put out, I liked as well to see as other creatures that have eyes and know no other way. But were it told to me today that I might have the sky for mine, I tell you that my heart would split for size of me. The meadows, mine, the mountains, mine, all forests, stintless stars, as much of noon as I could take between my finite eyes. The motions of the dipping birds, the morning's amber road, for mine to look at when I liked, the news would strike me dead. So safer, guess, with just my soul upon the window pane where other creatures put their eyes, incautious of the sun.
All right, what do we notice? Who can start?
I I just think about, I wonder about the capitalization
Yeah,
of the mostly natural, it seems like the natural, I don't know what Morning Amber Road is, at this sunrise, I don't know, but making them like a real name
mhm,
that needs a capital. It makes them a real being that's
Mhm.
me.
yeah, that's a good observation. What
I
else do we notice?
noticed, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
I noticed that in the poem, the poet seems to reject the kind of observing that Blake is encouraging in favor of an inner eye, or with just my soul, open the window pane. Too much to look at.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting.
One of the things that stuck out to me right away was the central stanza and how it's 5 lines long instead of 4. But
Yes.
actually, I mean, the pattern of the poem is 8 syllables, 6 syllables, 8, 6. And the first 2 lines are really split into 4 and 4, which goes back to the word split from the prior stanza.
Yeah. She's becoming so large that it can't be contained. Even the line splits. That's great. I like that. What questions do we have of this poem? Dickinson is hard, so feel free if you're wondering, what is she saying here? What are the questions we have of this poem? What do you wonder about?
I wonder what she means about putting my eye out. How,
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of eye was it? Was it, and the poem is so just about her and what she sees or not sees. So I wonder I wonder how she started that poem with that line.
Good question.
I wonder how much biographical background will influence one's reading of this poem.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's
And
a
I wanna-
really,
And I just want to point out also the pun in the first line. Before I got my eye put out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Playful. Yeah.
You could reverse the 2 eyes as well in meaning and still have meaning. Before I changed, and transformed into my next person, my next blind person, sightless person.
Yep.
just to add a biographical note about sight and vision.
Yes.
I had to look this, I didn't know any of this at all, but I had to look it up. But apparently the key medical concern of her adult life was an eye problem, affliction that she suffered in her mid-30s. And I looked up the dates, and this poem was actually written a year before she was under the care of a doctor in Boston. So perhaps she was even starting to experience the problem with her own eyes at this time.
That's helpful.
So I'm
I-
going to say I don't understand something.
Good.
I don't understand the last stanza.
Yeah.
Can anybody help?
One thing, just to put it all on our radar screen, is upon is an older way of spelling upon. So UPON. So it's
Right.
UP, so it's that, so it's upon the window pane, just clarifying that. Anybody want to take, I mean, in a way, it may be difficult to interpret the last stanza without just go ahead and interpreting the whole poem. So what do we think she's getting at here across the whole poem? And then we can kind of zero in on that climactic last stanza.
I found it helpful to read the first stanza and the final stanza back to back, and
Uh-huh.
then look at the middle and what was happening in between.
Okay.
I think that's an excellent comment, because someone mentioned before about the capitalization. And one thing you notice, apart from the last word, son, those two, the first and last stanzas have no capitalization. Most of the capitalization is in the central three stanzas. I think that has some significance.
So what do you think she's getting at? What's this poem about?
I have a sense that she's talking about the limitations of her consciousness, and I take the eye put out, meaning two kinds of vision, having some kind of conversion where you expand to the whole universe. She seems to be saying that's too difficult for me, and she contracts in the last stanza. But Dickinson is so clever and subversive that she actually takes us in the center of the poem. She takes us to this expansion, just like in the other poem we just mentioned. The center line of the whole poem is the stintless stars. Everything just expands out and then contracts back again, but almost to me as if her consciousness can't take the vastness in, can't know the sense of what we're able to know and what we can't know.
Any other ideas? Here's my thoughts about it. The biographical note about her trouble with eyesight is very helpful. It helps put it in context. I think she's, in my reading, I think what she's saying is that she is grappling and experiencing what it may be like to lose her eyesight. And that before she was having, or she imagines herself, what if she were blind? What if her eye was put out? Her eye or her faculty of sight.
Mm.
That before that, she liked to see just like any other creature, right? We all have eyes, we look, we don't know any better. We go around, we see, okay, yeah, there's a mountain, there's a tree, there's a, breakfast cereal. But today, I don't have my eyesight. And were I told would somebody tell me today that I could have the sky, that I could look anytime I want at the sky, my heart would split, because I'm blind. So she's in the position of a blind person, or imagining herself there, or worried about it, perhaps. Her heart would split because of her size, that she would grow through her sight. Because she could see the meadow, she could see the mountain, she could see the forest, she could see the stars. as much of noon as I could take between my finite eyes. Imagine that. Imagine being able to see all of these things, even birds, even, I like the interpretation of that as sunrise or sunset, I guess sunrise, morning's amber road. Even sunrise, to look at whenever I liked, the news would strike me dead. So in other words, she would be overcome with joy, I guess, but it's almost like a kind of awestruck joy that would strike her dead. And being dead, that would be a safer position for her, with just her soul there, because she's dead. So just her soul upon the window pane, where other creatures, so other, maybe her housemates, just look, with just kind of casually incautious of the sun, the kind of the power of the sun, the amazement of the faculty of sight, the amazement that we take for granted all the time. So for me, this is a poem about taking for granted the natural world, the beauty of the natural world, not just the sun, of course, but the birds, the sunrise, the forest, the mountains, the meadows, to as much of noontime as I could take whenever I liked, right? So that to me, that those lines at the bottom of the screen, for mine to look at when I liked the news that my sight would be restored, the news would strike me dead. And yet, as in the beginning of the poem, I think most of us are in the position of the beginning of the poem where we'd like to see, we have eyes and we know no other reality. So that's my interpretation, that she's writing from a position of blindness, or imagining herself in a position of a blind person, and how much she would be transformed were her sight restored. The message, or the suggestion, the encouragement being that we think anew about our faculty of sight today, that we appreciate it and appreciate the things that we can see all around us whenever we would like, right? We can look at these things whenever we like.
I'm
yeah.
not pushing back against that, but I just
please, feel
putting
free.
in the chat, I guess, I'm going to push back a little bit against sticking with blindness as literal, although I do understand that was an experience of hers. I feel it's a figurative interpretation that she works with in a lot of her poetry. And I think
Absolutely.
that I dwell in possibility of fairer house than prose, which I put in the chat,
Yes.
is a dialogue she has consistently with rejecting prose, which I would call like the news would strike me dead. News is prose. And she always fights for a different kind of language, a different kind of experience than the prose of news and plain sight.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't see that as in conflict at all. In other words, we could see this as blindness. That is, for lack of a better term, literal blindness, but we could also see it as a kind of figurative blindness, or an oblivion or obliviousness. I don't know if that's exactly what you mean, but
I guess I meant it's a choice. I don't see her as making the best of an affliction, as making a choice to favor possibility and imagination and inward eye and soul over telling the truth like it is. Tell the truth, but tell it slant, she writes.
Sure. No, that's interesting. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, to add on to what Carol's saying, what came to mind to me was the hymn Amazing Grace. Was blind, but now I see. And the connection for me was that the poem is written in what's called common meter, which is the 8/6/8/6. And hymns are written in that meter as well. And Emily Dickinson wrote a lot of things in that. I see the opening line as figurative also, and I guess the evidence I would supply would be the word creatures. Again, in that first and last stanza, that was a great comment where you said to read those together, because there's creature vision, and then there's there's creature sight, which is perceptual, but then there's some kind of special sight that human beings have, which is, I don't want to call it spiritual sight or visionary sight. And then she comes back to the creaturely sight at the end, but she does give us the experience in the center three of what the visionary is. So it's
Yeah, it's interesting. She often works on multiple levels at once. So I guess all I'd say is I wouldn't want to exclude I don't know if literal is quite the right way to say it, but the physical act of seeing from our set of interpretations. But this conversation is a great example of how there's different levels. That's one of the great things about poetry is you have multiple levels on which you can interpret. So that's great. I think as was said earlier, we could talk about this one all day.
Matt, I know we're running out of time, but I would just like to loop this back to your opening
Yeah.
and talking about McFarlane.
Yes.
This poem goes directly to awareness and your words of purr and schmooze. And once you become aware of them, then you start to see them.
Mhm. Yeah. That's a good connection. Absolutely. Well, that's great. Yeah. One of the reasons Emily Dickinson's so beloved and so enduring is that she repays rereading and rereading. You know, there's no simple interpretations, and there's always more treasure there when you go back. So let's keep going back to this one. But let's let this gentleman, James Weldon Johnson, have the last word. Anybody want to read the James Weldon Johnson to kind of move us forward here?
Keep losing my. You never find it. I'll read it when I find it. There's so many. I have all the songs. Here it is. Deep in the wood.
Yeah, deep in the quiet wood.
Okay. Are you bowed down in the? Excuse me. Are you bowed down in heart? Do you but hear the clashing discords and the din of life? Then come away. Come to the peaceful wood. Here, bathe your soul in silence. Listen. Now, from out the palpitating solitude, do you not catch, yet faint, elusive strains? They are above, around, within you, everywhere. Silently listen. Clear, and still more clear, they come. They bubble up in rippling notes and swell in singing tones. Now let your soul run the whole gamut of the wondrous scale until, responsive to the tonic chord, it touches the diapason of God's grand cathedral organ, filling earth for you with heavenly peace and holy harmonies.
So let's just take a couple of minutes on this one. What do you notice in James Weldon Johnson's poem? What stands out?
Silence and sound, the listen, but silent, back and forth.
Yes. Others?
I'd say ecstasy.
Where do you see that?
It's just where I feel it in the whole poem.
Yeah. That's
It's
good.
very ecstatic.
Any others?
To me, there's kind of there's definitely like a religious or spiritual quality to this, like almost like a hymn.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting that he talks about the organ at the end, because I can
Yes.
really feel some kind of sound quality like that. Yeah.
You may already know, all of you, but I'll just mention it just in case it's helpful, that James Weldon Johnson wrote the lyrics and really is credited with writing the whole hymn, Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is known across the country as the African-American national anthem, so to speak. He's a wonderful musical poet.
Hmm.
Any other thoughts about, I mean, this is certainly a poem about the restorative powers of the natural world and is very much in keeping with this kind of tradition of nature as reviving, or the consolations of nature. Nature as a place to go when you are in trouble of some kind, because it will help you, nourish you. But any other thoughts about what Johnson is getting at here, what the heart of his argument is?
It also seems very strongly to me anti, I lost the word. Factories, cities,
Mhm, industrialization.
the discord of life.
Yeah.
If you're brought down by that, get out to nature and
Mhm.
you're gonna hear God's great organ.
Yes. Seeing the whole earth as a symphony.
Seeing the whole earth as divine, as
Mhm.
God's creation is part of the divinity. And it's interesting because the other poem you had us read by Dickinson talks about not going to church but staying home, and it's the same idea.
Right.
The grand cathedral organ, all of nature as a cathedral.
Yes.
What is what does diapason mean?
Diapason is part of an organ. It's sort of the central part of the organ pipe, you could
From
say.
which all sound goes out?
Yeah, I'll read you. I had it here because I asked that question too. It says an organ stops sounding a main register of flue pipes, typically of 8-foot pitch, or can also mean a grand swelling burst of harmony. So you can think of it as part of the organ or part of what the organ produces in this swelling burst of harmony.
Well, there certainly is this, people who have told me they've had a born again experience talk about this whole swelling, orgasmic thing sexually, but spiritually, of an overflowing. And I see that here. And I don't know if it's for what he believes, like God enter your soul, or is it earth the God entering your soul, or is it earth and God
Uh-huh. Right.
entering your soul to make you feel that it's going to be all right? Isn't that heavenly peace and holy harmonies?
Right. Right. Yes.
It's and the realization that you too are part of the divinity.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Which
Yeah.
ties into a lot of the like the transcendentalists and many others. Of course, in the case of some of the transcendentalists, they're also reaching back to, or reaching over to Eastern religions as well. So yeah, there's lots of religion and philosophy here. But obviously James Weldon Johnson is going to be squarely within the African-American Christian tradition here, but there's a lot of resonance, so to speak, in the different music of the different traditions. All right, great. Well, we're just over time, so we'll return to our final image, which will be our final image each time, and we can all go out and find a smooze. Here's a smooze for you to search for out there. So we'll see each other in a week's time, and thank you very much. Great discussion. We'll keep it going, and we'll keep digging deeper. Go and find as many smoozes as we can. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.